Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a world of marble columns, sun-drenched hillsides, and absolutely breathtaking social scandals, ancient Greece. Specifically, we're talking about something historians have tiptoed around for centuries, and your high school textbook definitely left out the summary. The fact that ancient Greek society was, by modern standards, extraordinarily, openly, unapologetically gay. Not whispered about gay, not we don't discuss it gay. Celebrated in poetry, honoured in philosophy, depicted on pottery you can still see in museums gay. So before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and a truly heartfelt thank you to the viewer who suggested this one. You know who you are, and honestly brilliant call. Your suggestions are what shape this channel and keep it growing, and I mean that. The channel is also now live on Spotify, so if you'd rather drift off to this one through your earbuds, you'll find the link in the description. Now go ahead and dim the lights, put on a fan for that soft background hum, pull up your blanket and get comfortable. Let's pause for a second, because have you ever actually thought about what daily life in ancient Greece looked like once you strip away the drama masks and the Olympics? Did people just walk around being openly in love with whoever they wanted? Was there a word for any of this? Or did everyone just sort of quietly understand? What did the philosophers actually say about desire, like at dinner, out loud, in front of everyone? Were the rules enforced? Did anyone feel weird about any of it? Or was weird the entirely wrong framework? Could you hold someone's hand in the Agora, or was public affection more of a private courtyard kind of situation? And what happened when the Romans showed up and had opinions? Congratulations. You have just woken up in ancient Greece. The year is somewhere around the 5th century BCE. The sun is already brutal, the wine is already watered down, and someone nearby is either reciting Sappho or arguing about the nature of the soul. Possibly both. Welcome. Before we get into anything scandalous, let's set the scene properly, because ancient Greece was not one place and not one time. It was a sprawling, fractured, deeply competitive collection of city-states: Athens, Sparta, Corinth, Thebes, each with its own laws, its own customs, and its own very strong opinions about how everyone else was doing it wrong. You haven't woken up in a single unified country with a tidy national identity. You've woken up in a world of sun-bleached stone, olive groves, salt air, and a level of civic drama that would make a modern reality show producer weep with envy. You open your eyes, and the first thing you notice is the light. It's early, and already the sky outside is a colour that doesn't really have a name in modern English, a deep burning blue, the kind that only exists in places where the air is dry and the sea is close. You're in Athens, probably, because Athens is where most of what we're about to discuss happened with the most documentation and the most enthusiasm. The city is already awake. Somewhere nearby, someone is grinding grain. A goat is making its opinion known about something. The smell of olive oil is everywhere, which is appropriate, because olive oil is essentially the duct tape of ancient Greek civilization. It goes in the food, it goes on the body, it goes in the lamps, it goes in the religious offerings. If something needs doing, there is a 50% chance that olive oil is involved. Your home, if you're a male citizen of reasonable standing, is a modest structure arranged around a central courtyard. The rooms are small, the furniture is simple. What matters in Athenian life is not the private interior, but the public exterior. The Agora, the gymnasium, the law courts, the theatres, the temples, the places where a man goes to be seen, to argue, to worship, to compete. Private life is for sleeping and eating. Real life happens outside, in public, among other men. And that's important context for everything that follows, because so much of what made ancient Greek society distinct from modern Western society comes down to this fundamental orientation toward public, communal, male life. Women, in Athens particularly, existed largely within the domestic sphere. Slaves, and Athens had a great many of them, performed much of the physical labour that kept the city running. The male citizen was, in theory, free for the higher pursuits: philosophy, politics, athletics, military service, and the dense, complicated social world of his peers. Now, Athens was not Greece. This bears repeating. Sparta, 200 miles to the south, had a social structure so different from Athens that historians sometimes struggle to believe the two cities were part of the same civilization. Sparta was militaristic, communal, and deeply suspicious of luxury. Spartan boys left their families at age 7 to be raised by the state in a brutal collective training system. Spartan women had considerably more freedom than Athenian women. They exercised publicly, managed estates, and were expected to be physically strong. In Sparta, the values that mattered were courage, endurance, and loyalty. In Athens, the values that mattered were eloquence, intelligence, and beauty. You can already see why these two cities never really got along. Corinth was wealthy and cosmopolitan, a trading hub with a famous temple, and an even more famous reputation for its commercial sex trade. Thebes was the underdog city, often overlooked, occasionally brilliant, and responsible for one of the most astonishing military innovations in Greek history, which we'll get to shortly. Each city-state was, in effect, its own small civilization, shaped by its own geography, economy, and historical memory. What they shared was the language, Greek, in its various dialects, the gods, more or less, and a deep competitive pride in being Greek rather than barbaros, which is what they called everyone who didn't speak Greek, a word that meant literally someone who makes sounds like bar 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 instead of forming actual words. Flattering. The Greek world in the 5th century BCE was also expanding rapidly, with colonies scattered across the Mediterranean from southern France to the coast of the Black Sea. Trade, ideas and people moved constantly across this network. This is the world you've just woken up in. It's beautiful, deeply unequal, intensely intellectual, casually brutal, and absolutely convinced of its own superiority. And somewhere in the middle of all of this, there is a set of attitudes toward love and desire so different from anything you've been taught to expect that they will require, as the Greeks like to say, a complete re-examination of your assumptions. Let's begin. Here is the first thing historians want you to understand, and it's genuinely mind-bending once it lands. The ancient Greeks did not have a word for homosexuality. Not because the concept didn't exist, clearly it did, and clearly they had robust thoughts about it, but because their entire framework for thinking about desire was simply different from ours. They weren't organising the world into categories of straight and gay. They were thinking about something else entirely, and once you understand what that something else was, everything else in this video starts to make a very particular kind of sense. The word homosexuality itself is surprisingly modern. It was coined in the 19th century, 1869 specifically, by an Austro-Hungarian journalist named Carl Maria Kurt Benny, who invented it partly as a legal and medical category to describe a particular type of person. Before that word existed, there was no single term in Western languages for the idea that some people are primarily attracted to people of the same sex. That's not because the experience didn't exist. It clearly did. It's because for most of human history, desire was categorized differently, by the act, not the identity, by the role, not the orientation, by the person's social position, not the gender of who they were drawn to. Ancient Greek had plenty of words for specific acts and relationships. It had words for the older partner in a pederastic relationship and the younger one. It had words for desire, for passion, for the specific kind of longing that feels like a sickness. It had the word Eros, which named both the god and the force he represented. What it didn't have was a word that grouped people into a category based on the sex of who they desired. That concept simply wasn't how they organised the world. Think about what that means for a moment. If you don't have a word that separates people into those who desire the same sex and those who desire the other sex, then you don't have a framework for treating one group as fundamentally different from the other. You don't have a concept of sexual identity in the modern sense. What you have instead is a world in which desire of many kinds is understood as part of the general human experience, something that happens to people, that flows in various directions, that is governed by rules of propriety and role, but that doesn't define what kind of person you fundamentally are. This is a profound difference. Modern Western culture, at least since the 19th century, has tended to treat sexual orientation as a core aspect of personal identity. Who you're attracted to is considered part of who you are. The ancient Greeks didn't think this way. A man who enjoyed relations with both women and younger men wasn't considered to have two identities, or to be oscillating between categories. He was simply a man who desired in the various ways that men desired. The desire itself wasn't the interesting part. The interesting part was whether you were behaving with appropriate dignity, propriety and restraint, categories that applied equally to all desire, regardless of its direction. This doesn't mean ancient Greece was a utopia of sexual freedom. There were rules, and the rules were enforced through social pressure, reputation, and in some cases law. But the rules were organised around entirely different axes than modern ones. Status mattered enormously. Age mattered. The role you occupied in a relationship, active or passive, pursuer or pursued, mattered deeply. The gender of the person you desired mattered considerably less than almost any of these other factors. The result was a world in which what we would now call same-sex desire was neither invisible nor extraordinary. It was woven into the literature, the philosophy, the mythology, and the daily social fabric of Greek life, in ways that later civilizations found so uncomfortable they spent centuries pretending they hadn't read what they'd clearly read. When 19th century scholars translated Greek texts and encountered the unmistakable evidence, some of them quietly substituted pronouns or added footnotes suggesting the poets were speaking metaphorically. They were not speaking metaphorically. The Greeks were, as usual, speaking with complete directness about exactly what they meant. The Greeks had a god for this, naturally. His name was Eros, and unlike the cherubic little Cupid figure of later centuries, the early Eros was something far older and stranger, a primordial force, one of the first things to exist in the cosmos, the raw engine of connection and longing that holds the universe together. When a Greek said they were seized by Eros, they weren't making a cute romantic observation. They were describing something that felt and was meant to feel like a visitation from outside themselves, overwhelming, disorienting, and not entirely within their control. Hesiod, writing in the 8th century BCE, listed Eros among the very first things to come into existence, right there alongside chaos, earth, and the underworld. Before the gods, before the titans, before the world had taken its recognizable shape, there was Eros, the force that draws things toward each other, the principle of attraction that makes matter cohere, that makes living things seek other living things, that makes a person look across a room and feel suddenly, catastrophically interested in someone they have never met before. The Greeks weren't being poetic when they described this as a divine force. They meant it quite literally. Desire was not a personal quirk, it was a cosmic principle. By the classical period, Eros had taken on more specific characteristics. He was the son of Aphrodite, the goddess of love and beauty, and he carried his arrows everywhere, gold-tipped ones to ignite passion, lead-tipped ones to extinguish it. He was capricious, playful, occasionally vicious, and fundamentally indifferent to whether his interventions were convenient for the people involved. This is a useful thing to understand about the Greek gods generally. They were not moral exemplars. They were forces, and Eros as a force did not discriminate based on the sex of his targets. Aphrodite herself governed a domain that the Greeks understood as much broader than what modern English speakers usually mean by love. She governed beauty, desire, physical pleasure, the magnetic pull between people, the longing that makes you do things you know are unwise. All of it fell under her jurisdiction. And she was understood to operate across all combinations of persons. The myths about Aphrodite's interventions involve men desiring women, gods desiring mortals, and a perfectly straightforward divine interest in the desire between men as well. She wasn't a goddess of heterosexual love. She was a goddess of desire, full stop. The Greeks also distinguished between different kinds of love, and this is where their vocabulary becomes genuinely rich. Eros was passionate, often destabilizing desire, the kind that arrives without warning and reorganizes your priorities. Philia was the deep affection of friendship, the love between companions and equals, the bond forged by shared experience and mutual respect. Storge was familial affection, the love between parents and children, and agape, a word that would later take on enormous significance in Christian theology, was something more like goodwill, a broad benevolent love that extended toward humanity generally. What's striking is that the Greeks understood all of these as genuinely different things, each valuable in its own way, each governed by its own logic. Eros and Philia were not in competition. A relationship could contain both. The deepest relationships, the ones the philosophers got most interested in, were the ones where passionate desire had matured into something deeper, mutual knowledge, shared virtue, a bond that had been tested and held. This was considered the highest form of human connection, and it was described in relation to same-sex bonds just as readily as any other kind. For the average Athenian walking through the Agora, Eros wasn't an abstraction, it was an explanation. When you saw a beautiful young man in the gymnasium and felt your thoughts reorganize themselves accordingly, the Greeks had a framework for that. You had been touched by Eros. This wasn't shameful. It was in a sense an honour, evidence that you were susceptible to beauty, which was itself a kind of virtue. The Greeks believed, with great seriousness, that beauty was not merely pleasant but morally significant. That beautiful things pointed towards something true and good about the structure of the universe, that the person who was drawn to beauty was, in some meaningful way, being drawn toward wisdom. This is the philosophical scaffolding underneath everything else that follows. When Plato's characters sit around talking about love and desire for hours at a time, they are not being excessive. They are working out the implications of a worldview in which desire and philosophy are not separate domains but deeply connected ones, in which the question, what does it mean to want something, leads inevitably to the question, what does it mean to know something? If you wanted to understand how ancient Athenian men thought about love, desire, beauty, and the proper relationship between bodies and souls, you could do worse than attending a symposium, not a conference, not a seminar, a drinking party, reclining couches, garlands of flowers, watered wine poured by beautiful attendants, and the expectation that someone, at some point, would say something worth remembering. The Symposium was the intellectual and erotic heart of elite Athenian male culture, and the two things were not considered separate. The word itself means drinking together, and the format was highly ritualized. You would arrive at the home of your host after dinner. Having already eaten, the symposium was about wine and conversation, not food. You'd be shown to a couch, where you reclined on your left side in the prescribed manner, propped up on one elbow, free hand available for a cup. The room held anywhere from 7 to 30 guests. The host, or sometimes a designated master of the revels, would determine how much water to mix with the wine, Pure wine was considered barbaric and somewhat dangerous, the drink of people who didn't understand moderation. Music arrived. A flute girl, almost certainly enslaved, played in the corner. Sometimes there were other performers, dancers, acrobats, people who did things with torches that you'd rather not examine too closely. Sometimes there was recitation of poetry, or riddles, or a game called Kottabos in which the guests flicked the dregs of their wine cups at a target. This was considered both a test of skill and a form of divination, the direction of the flung wine revealing something about one's erotic luck. It was genuinely a very good party. But the Symposium was also serious. It was where alliances were formed, where political conversations happened that could not happen in public, where young men were brought into the company of their elders and measured for potential. It was where reputations were made through wit and eloquence, and where they were destroyed through foolishness or excess. Everything that happened at a symposium was simultaneously social, political, intellectual, and erotic, and all of these dimensions were understood to be operating at once, at all times, without contradiction. The physical layout created intimacy by design. Reclining men shared couches, sometimes in pairs. The space was small enough that everyone could hear everyone else. Wine circulated continuously. The whole architecture of the evening pushed toward a kind of lowered guard, an openness to connection, to disclosure, to the kind of conversation you wouldn't have standing upright in daylight in the Agora. What was said at the symposium stayed at the symposium more or less, though given that several of the greatest philosophical texts in Western history were reconstructed from symposia, more or less is doing some work in that sentence. Desire was present at the symposium as a matter of course. The attendants were chosen partly for their beauty. The guests themselves were often in various states of admiration toward one another. The poetry that was recited frequently concerned love, erotic poetry in the original sense of that word, poetry about Eros, about longing, about beautiful people and the people who couldn't stop thinking about them. To be moved by a beautiful boy at a symposium was not embarrassing. It was expected. To pretend not to notice beauty was considered a kind of philosophical failure, an inability to perceive what was genuinely there. At the same time, the symposium had rules about restraint. The point was not simply to act on every impulse. That would have been considered lacking in self-control, which was one of the central Greek virtues. The point was to appreciate, to feel, to be genuinely alive to the presence of beauty, and to use that aliveness as fuel for thought, for connection, for the kind of conversation that elevated everyone in the room. The desire was the engine. What you did with the engine was the measure of your character. Somewhere around 385 BCE, Plato wrote a philosophical dialogue so strange and so human that people are still reading it, arguing about it, and occasionally falling in love with it today. It's set at a dinner party. Several prominent Athenian men, including the playwright Aristophanes, the physician Eryximachus, and eventually Socrates, take turns giving speeches about Eros. Each speech is different. Some are funny, some are brilliant. One, famously, involves the idea that humans were originally double creatures, split apart by the gods and forever seeking their other half, which could be a male half, a female half, or either, depending on the original whole. The occasion, in the text, is a party at the home of the playwright Agathon, who is celebrating his first victory at a dramatic festival. The guests are hungover from the previous night celebrating and have agreed to drink moderately and spend the evening giving speeches in praise of Eros, the god of love who has, they agree, been scandalously neglected by previous poets and philosophers. This premise is, itself, slightly absurd, and Plato knows it. But the absurdity creates space for the speeches to be both serious and playful, which is exactly the register Plato likes to operate in. The first speech, by Phaedrus, argues that Eros is the oldest of the gods, and that love is uniquely productive of virtue, particularly military virtue. A beloved man will behave better in front of his lover than in front of anyone else, Phaedrus argues. He will not disgrace himself. He will fight harder. He will die more nobly. An army of lovers would be undefeatable. This is not abstract theorizing. Phaedrus is describing something that Greek men actually believed about their world, and that Thebes would eventually test empirically with the sacred band. The physician Eryximaios gives a speech that connects love to medicine and natural philosophy. Eros as a principle of harmony operating throughout the natural world, not just in human hearts. Then comes Aristophanes, whose speech will give its own full segment later, because it deserves one. Then Agathon, who gives a beautiful but slightly hollow speech praising Eros as the most beautiful and most good of the gods, which Socrates politely and methodically dismantles. And then Socrates speaks, but characteristically he doesn't speak in his own voice. He reports a conversation he once had with a woman named Diotima, a philosopher from Mantinea whom he describes as his teacher in matters of love. This is remarkable in itself. Plato, writing in a culture where women had almost no public intellectual life, has Socrates attribute his deepest understanding of love and desire to a woman. Whether Diotima was a real person or a fictional construction remains debated. What she says is not debated. It's among the most influential philosophical passages ever written. Diotima's teaching is this: desire begins with a beautiful body, but if you pursue it properly, it leads you upward from one beautiful body to beautiful bodies generally, then to beautiful souls, then to beautiful practices and laws, then to beautiful knowledge, and finally to beauty itself, the absolute, eternal, unchanging form of beauty from which all particular beautiful things derive. This is Plato's ladder of love, and it transforms erotic desire into a philosophical journey. The attraction you feel toward a beautiful person is not a distraction from wisdom. It is, if you follow it correctly, the beginning of the path to wisdom. Then the door bursts open and Alcibiades arrives, drunk, wreathed in ivy, and determined to make a speech about Socrates instead of about Eros, which is how the most sophisticated philosophical work about love in the ancient world ends, with a beautiful, charismatic, probably still somewhat drunk Athenian general telling everyone exactly why he finds Socrates utterly maddening and utterly irresistible. It is perfect. It remains 2,500 years later completely perfect. This is the part of the video where we have to address something directly, clearly, and without flinching, because it's both central to understanding ancient Greek society and deeply uncomfortable by modern standards. Among elite Greek men, particularly in Athens, there existed a formalized practice called Pedestry, a mentorship relationship between an older man and an adolescent boy that was simultaneously educational, social, and in many cases explicitly erotic. It was considered respectable. It was governed by unwritten but widely understood rules, and it was nothing like the equal, consensual relationships we value today. Let's be honest with each other here for a moment. There is no version of this that translates cleanly into modern ethical terms, and historians who try to soften it with euphemism aren't serving anyone well. The Erastes, the older man, was typically in his 20s or 30s. The Eromenos, the younger beloved, was typically between 12 and 17 or 18. The relationship was publicly acknowledged, often celebrated, and understood as a fundamental part of a young man's education and social formation. It was also, by any modern framework we have for thinking about consent and power and age, not acceptable. That said, understanding it requires holding two things simultaneously: the ethical judgment that the modern world has rightly developed, and the genuine historical effort to understand what this practice meant within its own context. Because without that understanding, you can't understand Greek philosophy, Greek military culture, Greek art, or Greek society at any meaningful depth. You'd be looking at an enormous proportion of Greek civilization through a blurred lens. Within the Greek framework, the relationship was not supposed to be purely about the older man's gratification. The Erastes had genuine obligations. He was supposed to provide his eromenos with education, social connections, moral guidance, and a model of how to be a man in the world. He was supposed to help the younger person develop into a virtuous citizen. The relationship was evaluated publicly by the community, not just on whether it existed, but on whether the older man was behaving honourably, whether the younger man's character was improving, whether the whole arrangement was producing the kind of human being Athens needed. The young person was not, by the Greek understanding, supposed to feel desire in the same way. He was supposed to feel admiration, affection and gratitude, a kind of response to being singled out and valued, to having someone invest in your development. If he appeared too eager for physical contact, it reflected poorly on his character. The eromenos was supposed to be somewhat reluctant, yielding eventually out of affection and respect, not out of his own passion. This distinction was considered morally important, and it reveals the profound inequality built into the whole structure. The physical dimension of these relationships, when it existed, was also governed by specific rules. Certain acts were considered acceptable, others were considered degrading to the younger person, and thus forbidden to an honourable Erastes. The rules existed because Greek society understood, even if it didn't articulate this in modern terms, that there was something in this relationship that needed governing, that the power differential was real, that the younger person was in a vulnerable position. None of this makes the practice acceptable, but it does make it comprehensible, and comprehending it is necessary for understanding why the Greeks could write about love between men with such warmth, depth, and philosophical seriousness. The paideia, the education of the young, was the project that these relationships were supposed to serve. At its best, in the ideal that Greek culture aspired to, it produced men of intelligence, virtue, and civic commitment. At its worst, and certainly often, it was exploitation wearing the costume of philosophy. If Athens was doing things one way, you could almost guarantee that Sparta was doing them with more militarism, more discipline, and a significantly shorter speech about the philosophy behind it. Spartan society had its own version of formalized relationships between older warriors and young men in training, and in some ways it was even more institutionalized than the Athenian model, built directly into the Agora, the brutal state-run education system that turned Spartan boys into the soldiers everyone else was terrified of. The affection between a Spartan warrior and his young protege was meant to produce courage, loyalty, and a willingness to die spectacularly. The Agora began at age 7. At 7, a Spartan boy was taken from his family and placed in a communal group with other boys his age. He would sleep outdoors in all seasons, eat barely enough to survive. The expectation was that he'd supplement his rations by stealing, and if he was caught stealing, he was punished. Not for the theft, but for being caught, because getting caught was evidence of insufficient skill. He would be beaten regularly, not as punishment for specific offences, but as a general preparation for pain. He would learn to fight, to endure, to never complain, and to consider his group of fellow trainees as the primary community of his life. Into this system, Spartan culture built what it called ispnilas, a relationship between a youth and an adult warrior that was explicitly mentoristic, and, according to ancient sources, had an acknowledged erotic dimension. The word means something like one who breathes in, referring to the older man's role as a kind of model whose virtues the younger person was supposed to inhale and internalize. The relationship was public, acknowledged by families and governed by community oversight. If a Spartan boy behaved dishonorably, His Spinellas could be punished along with him, which tells you something about how deeply the mentorship was understood to operate. Sparta was unusual among Greek city-states in several ways that matter here. Spartan women, as mentioned earlier, had considerably more public freedom than Athenian women. They exercised, ran races, competed in athletics, managed estates. They were expected to produce physically strong children, which required their own bodies to be strong. They were known for speaking bluntly. The word laconic, meaning brief and pithy speech, comes from Laconia, the region of Sparta. Spartan mothers famously told their sons to return from battle either carrying their shields or on them, meaning victorious or dead. This relative equality for women created an interesting parallel situation. Ancient sources suggest that institutionalized bonds between women in Sparta existed alongside the male system, that older Spartan women took young women under their mentorship in ways that mirrored the Spinellas. The evidence for this is less detailed than the evidence for male relationships, partly because ancient writers were generally more interested in what men were doing, and partly because women's lives were simply less thoroughly documented. But the pattern appears to have existed. The Spartan system produced soldiers of legendary quality, men who had been trained since childhood to fight alongside their companions, to feel a personal bond with the men beside them in the line, to consider retreat or cowardice a betrayal not just of Sparta, but of the specific individuals who trusted them. The military function of these bonds was not incidental. It was, from Sparta's perspective, the entire point. Sparta had no interest in philosophy for its own sake. It had no Plato, no Socrates, no tradition of symposia where men reclined and argued about the nature of Eros. What Sparta had was a practical program for producing warriors, and it had discovered empirically that bonds of love and loyalty between men made those warriors harder to break. When you understand this, the sacred band of Thebes, which we'll discuss in the next segment, stops being surprising and starts looking like the logical endpoint of something that multiple Greek city-states have been developing in various forms for generations. Love as military technology, loyalty as a weapon, the bond between two men as the single hardest thing an enemy has to defeat. In the 4th century BCE, the city of Thebes fielded a military unit so unusual, so psychologically unusual, that it baffled and fascinated its enemies in equal measure. It was called the Sacred Band, 300 elite soldiers organised into 150 pairs of male lovers. The logic was simple and, in context, devastatingly practical. A man will fight harder beside his beloved than beside anyone else. He will not retreat. He will not leave the body. He will not be separated. For nearly 4 decades, the Sacred Band was undefeated in battle. Their end, when it came, was the stuff of legend. The Sacred Band was founded around 378 BCE, traditionally credited to a Theban general and statesman named Gorgidas, though it was under the later command of Pelopidas that it achieved its greatest fame. The idea behind it drew directly on the philosophical tradition we've been discussing, the argument that Phaedrus makes in Plato's Symposium, the argument that Sparta had been implementing implicitly for generations, the Greek intuition that erotic love and military virtue were not competing forces but complementary ones. Take that intuition, make it the structural principle of an elite fighting unit. See what happens. What happened was remarkable. Thebes in the early 4th century was not a military superpower. It was a secondary city-state that had spent decades under Spartan domination, having capitulated after the Peloponnesian War, and spent years with a Spartan garrison occupying its citadel. The Sacred Band was part of a broader Theban military and political revival, a conscious effort to build something formidable out of a city that the dominant powers of the Greek world had been treating as an afterthought. At the Battle of Leuctra in 371 BCE, the sacred band fought as the spearhead of a Theban force that defeated the Spartan army in open battle, something that had been considered essentially impossible. The Spartans were the greatest soldiers in the Greek world. They had not lost a major land battle to another Greek force in over a century. At Leuctra, Thebes broke them. The sacred band was central to that victory, engaging and defeating the Spartan elite infantry in direct combat. The effect on the Greek world was seismic. Sparta's aura of invincibility evaporated in an afternoon. Thebes became, briefly, the dominant power in Greece, and the sacred band, 300 men, 150 pairs of lovers, was celebrated across the Greek world as the thing that had made it possible. The band continued to fight and to win for another generation, until it met an opponent that even love couldn't overcome. At the Battle of Chaeronea in 338 BCE, they faced the Macedonian army of Philip II and his 18-year-old son Alexander, leading the cavalry on the left. The Macedonians were fighting with a new and brutally effective tactical system. The sacred band held its formation and refused to retreat even as the battle was lost around it. Every single member of the band died where he stood. Philip II, who had spent years at Thebes as a young hostage and knew exactly who these men were, reportedly wept when he saw the 300 bodies lying in formation at the end of the battle. He said, or was remembered to have said, that anyone who thought these men had done or suffered anything shameful deserved to die himself. Their bodies were buried at Chaeronea, where a marble lion still stands above their grave today. On the island of Lesbos, sometime around the late 7th and early 6th century BCE, a woman named Sappho was writing poetry so precise, so achingly physical, so emotionally exact about her desire for other women, that fragments of it have survived 2,500 years and still stop readers cold. She ran what seems to have been a kind of school or community for young women. She was celebrated across the ancient world as one of the greatest lyric poets who ever lived, and she wrote, plainly and without apparent shame, about longing for, losing, and grieving women she loved. We don't have a lot of Sappho. This is one of the great tragedies of literary history. She apparently wrote 9 books of lyric poetry, plus epithalamia, wedding songs and other pieces. What survives is fragments, some poems more or less complete, many others in pieces, a line here, a phrase there, words quoted by later writers who found them worth preserving, even when the context was lost. We know she existed. We know she was famous. We know she was compared to Homer in antiquity, which was about the highest compliment the ancient world had to offer. We know she was from Mytilene on Lesbos. We know almost nothing else about her life with certainty, and we know her work mostly in pieces, like a mosaic that's been dropped. What we have is enough. Fragment 31 is perhaps the most famous, sometimes called Veine tai moi, he seems to me, and it describes watching a woman talking and laughing with a man, and feeling, at that sight, a physical cascade. The tongue breaks, a subtle fire runs beneath the skin, the eyes see nothing, the ears ring, cold sweat covers the body, the whole person trembles and goes pale. It is a description of what we would now call a panic response induced by jealousy and desire, rendered with such precision that it reads like a clinical observation and a confession at the same time. The ancient world knew exactly what Sappho was writing about. Later authors reference her desire for women explicitly. Plato called her the 10th muse. The poet Horace held her up as a model of lyric perfection. She was not a marginal or embarrassing figure. She was canonical, celebrated, placed on coins, memorialized in art. The fact that she wrote about desire for women was known and apparently unremarkable to most ancient readers, at least for several centuries after her death. Her name and her island have given the modern world two words, sapphic and lesbian, both still in use, both carrying her inheritance. This is an unusual kind of immortality, to have your name become a permanent part of human vocabulary, for something you simply lived and wrote about honestly. There is something fitting about it, given that Sappho's poetry was itself a form of naming, of finding the exact words for experiences that people were having but that no one had yet made precise. What her life looked like in practice remains genuinely uncertain. The Thiassos, the word sometimes used for the community of young women she seems to have led, may have been a ritual community connected to a goddess's worship, or an educational community for elite young women, or simply the natural social world of an exceptional woman with exceptional connections. Ancient sources disagree. What seems clear is that she had deep, specific, named attachments to women around her, and that the loss of those attachments was something she wrote about with a grief that has never aged. Reading Sappho across the centuries, what you feel, if you're paying attention, is recognition. Not recognition of a historical peculiarity or an interesting anthropological artifact, but recognition of something specific and human and evidently unchanging. What it feels like to see someone across a room and feel the air leave your body. Whatever else changed between the island of Lesbos in 600 BCE and wherever you're listening to this from tonight, that part appears to have remained completely, inconveniently constant. Before we go too far into the story of Sappho and the question of how women in ancient Greece experienced desire and connection, we need to be honest about the broader context, because Greek women, particularly in Athens, lived lives of significant restriction. They were largely confined to the domestic sphere. They did not attend the symposia. They did not vote, own property in most cases, or participate publicly in the philosophical debates their male counterparts were having about love and beauty. The freedoms that elite Greek men experienced in expressing desire were not, for the most part, mirrored in women's lives. The Athenian ideal for a respectable woman was, bluntly put, invisibility. The Athenian orator Pericles, in his famous funeral oration, told the wives of the Athenian dead that the greatest glory for a woman was to be spoken of as little as possible, neither praised nor blamed, simply not mentioned. This was held up as a compliment. The less a respectable woman appeared in public discourse, even favourable public discourse, the better she was doing at being a respectable woman. You could spend a decade trying to think of a more effective system for erasing people from history, and you probably wouldn't come up with anything better than that. Athenian women of citizen standing were kept largely within the women's quarters of their homes, the gynekeion. They managed the household, supervised slaves, raised children, and participated in certain religious festivals that were among the few occasions when women moved through public space in organised groups. Marriage was arranged by their fathers or male guardians, typically when the girl was in her mid-teens, to a man considerably older. She had no legal standing to refuse. Once married, she passed from the authority of her father to the authority of her husband. Her job was to produce legitimate heirs and to run the home efficiently. This picture is specifically Athenian and specifically applies to women of citizen class. Other places and other social positions created different realities. In Sparta, as we've discussed, women had considerably more physical freedom and social respect. In other city-states, the rules varied, and women who were not of citizen class, enslaved women, foreign women, the hetairae who were educated companions and whose social role was complex and not reducible to simple categories, lived under different rules, with different degrees of freedom and different degrees of vulnerability. The hetairae are worth mentioning specifically because they appear in the historical record in ways that respectable Athenian women almost never do. These were women, often foreign-born outside the citizen class, who moved in elite male social circles, attended symposia, engaged in philosophical discussion, and were sometimes the most intellectually sophisticated women in Athens by virtue of having received an education that citizen women were typically denied. Aspasia, the companion of Pericles, was reportedly so sharp and politically influential that she attracted attacks from comedians and politicians alike. Whether those attacks were fair is another question. That she existed and was visible and had opinions that people took seriously enough to argue with, that's documented. The gap between what Athenian ideology said about women and what the historical record shows when you look closely is significant. Women participated in religious life in ways that gave them genuine public roles. Women poets existed. Sappho is the most famous, but not the only one. Women philosophers appeared in some philosophical traditions, particularly the Pythagoreans. The official ideology of female invisibility and the actual texture of women's lives were not perfectly aligned, as official ideologies about any group usually aren't. What remains true is that the philosophical and cultural world in which the Greeks worked out their ideas about same-sex desire was overwhelmingly a world of men talking to men. The texts that survive, the symposia that have been reconstructed, the philosophical tradition that has shaped Western thought, these are products of a male intellectual world that largely excluded women. When we talk about ancient Greek openness around same-sex desire, we are talking mostly about male same-sex desire, documented by men for a male audience, in a culture that simultaneously celebrated Sappho's genius and confined its wives to the women's quarters. That contradiction is real, and it deserves to be named. The Greeks had a goddess for love. Of course they did, and she was, by any measure, one of the most powerful and unpredictable figures in the entire pantheon. Aphrodite governed desire in all its forms, the desire between men and women, between men and men, the ruinous, obsessive passion that destroyed cities, and the quiet tenderness that made life worth living. She was not a comfortable goddess. She was not serene. She played favourites. She punished those who failed to honour her, and she had a deep and somewhat chaotic personal life that the Greeks recounted with enormous enthusiasm. Her origin story alone tells you something important. In one version, the older, stranger, more violent version, Aphrodite was born from the sea foam that formed around the severed genitals of the sky god Uranos, thrown into the ocean by his son Cronus. She rose from the water fully formed, beautiful beyond comprehension, carried to shore by waves and wind, and stepped onto land already a goddess of complete and devastating power. This is not the origin story of a gentle domestic deity. This is the origin story of a force, something born from violence and the sea, arriving without warning, impossible to contain. The Greeks painted her and sculpted her obsessively. The image of Aphrodite emerging from the water, serene, luminous, apparently unbothered by having just materialized from an act of cosmological mutilation, became one of the most reproduced images in Western art for 2,500 years and counting. Botticelli's Birth of Venus is the descendant of a Greek tradition that was itself the descendant of something even older, the deep human need to put a face on desire, to make it visible, to give it a form that can be honoured and appeased. She was also, by most accounts, genuinely dangerous to cross. The myths about Aphrodite's punishments are as instructive as the myths about her gifts. Hippolytus, the son of Theseus, devoted himself exclusively to the virgin goddess Artemis and refused to worship Aphrodite. Her response was to cause his stepmother Phaedra to fall into a consuming, catastrophic love for him, which ended in Phaedra's death, Hippolytus's death, and Theseus's permanent grief. The lesson was not subtle. Ignoring Aphrodite was not a neutral act. Desire could not simply be opted out of without consequences. It demanded acknowledgement, and she was not specifically the goddess of desire between men and women. This is the part that matters most for our purposes tonight. Aphrodite governed all desire that fell within her domain, and her domain was broad. She presided over the passionate attachments that Greeks understood as falling under Eros, which, as we've established, did not organize itself according to the sex of the people involved, but according to its intensity, its quality, and the roles of the people within it. The same goddess who blessed a marriage also blessed the bonds celebrated at the Symposium. The same divine force that drove Paris to his disastrous passion for Helen was understood to operate in the desire between men that the philosophers spent so much time analysing. There was a philosophical distinction, particularly in Plato, between two aspects of Aphrodite. Heavenly Aphrodite, Urania, was associated with the love between men, understood as the higher, more philosophically productive form of desire, the kind that led toward wisdom rather than mere physical satisfaction. Common Aphrodite, Pandemos, governed desire between men and women, understood as more oriented toward reproduction and physical pleasure, and therefore somewhat lower on the philosophical ladder. This distinction is itself revealing. It tells you something about Greek male intellectual culture's tendency to locate the highest forms of everything, including love, in the male homosocial world. But it also tells you that both forms were understood as genuinely divine, genuinely sacred, genuinely under Aphrodite's protection. There was no version of this mythology in which some forms of desire were blessed and others were beyond the pale. One of the more remarkable things about the Greeks' comfort with desire between men is that it was embedded directly into their mythology, including at the highest levels of divine power. Zeus himself, king of the gods, lord of Olympus, wielder of lightning bolts and cosmic authority, was said to have become so enamored with a beautiful Trojan youth named Ganymede that he transformed into an eagle, swooped down, and carried the boy up to Olympus to serve as cupbearer to the gods. This story was not considered scandalous. It was told in art, in poetry, in public decoration. It was simply part of what Zeus did. Ganymede was, by all ancient accounts, extraordinarily beautiful, the most beautiful of mortal men, according to the version in the Iliad. He was a Trojan prince tending his father's flocks on the slopes of Mount Ida, when Zeus spotted him. What happened next was swift and absolute. Zeus either transformed himself into an eagle or sent his eagle. The sources differ on the specifics, and the boy was carried up to Olympus, where he was made immortal and given the role of pouring wine at the feasts of the gods. His father was compensated with a gift of divine horses. Everyone appears to have considered this a reasonable resolution. The story was everywhere in Greek visual culture. Vases, sculptures, architectural decorations, Ganymede and the eagle appeared throughout the Greek world as a standard mythological motif. In Roman times, the myth continued to circulate with equal ease. The constellation Aquarius was sometimes identified with Ganymede. The largest moon of Jupiter, which the Romans named for Zeus, is called Ganymede to this day, named by the astronomer Galileo in the early 17th century. The myth survived every cultural transition it encountered, which tells you something about how deeply it was embedded. What the Greeks understood from this story is worth dwelling on. Zeus was not a marginal or questionable figure. He was the king of the gods, the ultimate authority in the Greek cosmic order, the father of gods and men, the guarantor of law and justice and the proper running of the universe. When Zeus desired Ganymede, that desire was not a scandal or a failing. It was simply Zeus being Zeus, powerful, drawn to beauty, acting on that attraction in the decisive way that supreme beings act. The desire of the most powerful figure in the cosmos for a beautiful young man was not something the Greeks used to question Zeus's authority or dignity. It was an illustration of the scale of Ganymede's beauty. Other gods had similar stories. Apollo, god of the sun, of music, of prophecy, of poetry and medicine and intellectual light, was said to have loved a Spartan youth named Hyacinthus with great passion. Hyacinthus was also loved by Zephyrus, the west wind, who became jealous of Apollo's attention. One day, while Apollo and Hyacinthus were throwing a discus together, Zephyrus redirected the discus with a gust of wind. It struck Hyacinthus and killed him. Apollo, grief-stricken, caused a flower to grow from the spilled blood, the hyacinth, which still carries the name. This is a story of divine love, divine jealousy, and divine grief, all organized around Apollo's desire for a beautiful male youth, and it was told with the same emotional register as any other story of love and loss in Greek mythology. Poseidon loved a youth named Pelops, whose story became the origin myth of the Olympic Games. Heracles, the greatest Greek hero, had multiple male loves celebrated in various traditions. The pattern repeated throughout the mythology. The gods desired men, the gods desired women, and both forms of desire were simply part of the texture of divine life, treated as equally natural, equally capable of producing both joy and catastrophe. This matters because mythology in the ancient world was not merely entertainment, it was theology, and it was also a model for human behaviour. When Zeus's desire for Ganymede was narrated at a symposium, it functioned partly as a divine precedent, evidence that the desire experienced by the men in that room was not merely acceptable, but was, in some sense, sanctioned from the top of the cosmic order down. Homer's Iliad is ostensibly about the Trojan War, the wrath of Achilles, and the terrible human cost of pride and conflict. But running through it like a river is a relationship between Achilles and his companion Patroclus that ancient Greek readers, and many modern ones, have understood as one of the great love stories of Western literature. The two men are inseparable. Achilles' grief when Patroclus is killed is total and annihilating, more overwhelming than anything else in the poem. He essentially stops functioning as a human being. He refuses to eat. He lies in the dirt and screams. The Iliad doesn't describe the relationship between Achilles and Patroclus using the vocabulary of romantic love. Homer doesn't need to. The depth of the bond is communicated through action, through grief, through the structure of the entire poem's second half. Achilles is the greatest warrior at Troy. He has withdrawn from the fighting in a rage over a slight to his honour. The Greek forces are losing badly without him. Everyone, generals, kings, even the gods, tries to bring him back, and nothing works because Achilles' pride is the immovable object at the centre of the poem. Then Patroclus puts on Achilles' armour and goes into battle in his place, and is killed by Hector. And Achilles returns to the fight, not for honour, not for glory, not for the Greeks, but to kill the man who killed Patroclus. His grief in the hours after Patroclus' death is described with a rawness that has no parallel elsewhere in the poem. He pours dust over his head. He tears his hair. The women who serve in the tent weep with him, but Homer notes that it is Patroclus they are mourning, and that Achilles is mourning something different, something that is not simply the loss of a companion. His mother, the sea goddess Thetis, comes up from the ocean because she hears him screaming. He tells her he no longer wants to live. He says he would rather die avenging Patroclus than live without him. He keeps the body of Patroclus with him and refuses to let it be buried. He cannot yet bear the finality of it until the gods intervene. Ancient Greek readers did not read this as ambiguous. Plato's characters in the Symposium discuss Achilles and Patroclus explicitly as lovers, though they debate which was the Erastes and which the Eromenos, a debate that itself shows how naturally the relationship mapped onto Greek frameworks for understanding male love. Aeschylus apparently wrote a tragedy, now lost, in which Achilles and Patroclus were explicitly lovers. Alexander the Great, who modelled himself on Achilles, reportedly wept at Achilles' tomb and called him fortunate for having had Patroclus to mourn him, which suggests Alexander was reading the relationship exactly as the ancient world generally read it. The reason this matters beyond the literary history is that the Iliad was not a marginal text. It was the foundational text of Greek civilization, the work that every educated Greek person knew, that boys memorized, that was quoted in philosophical arguments and political speeches, that defined Greek ideals of heroism, honor, and human excellence. The love between Achilles and Patroclus was not a footnote in that text. It was the emotional engine that drove the entire second half of the poem, the greatest story the Greeks told about their past, the story that defined their values and their identity, was structured around male love as its most powerful emotional force. When modern adaptations of the Iliad treat the relationship as a close friendship and nothing more, they're making a choice that most ancient Greeks would have found puzzling. Not because the ancient Greeks were projecting modern concepts backward, but because in their own terms, in their own cultural vocabulary, what Homer described was unmistakable. If you wanted a historical example of how seriously ancient Greeks took male love, you could start with the fact that one of the greatest military commanders in history, a man who conquered a territory stretching from Greece to the borders of India by the time he was 30, appears to have organized a significant portion of his emotional life around his relationship with his closest companion. Alexander the Great and Hephaestion were inseparable from childhood. They were educated together under Aristotle. They campaigned together for over a decade. When Hephaestion died of fever in 324 BCE, Alexander's grief was so extreme it frightened his generals. Alexander and Hephaestion had grown up together at the Macedonian court, part of the cohort of elite boys educated together under Aristotle at Mysa, arguably the most extraordinary classroom in history, given what several of its students went on to do. By the time Alexander launched his Persian campaign in 334 BCE, Hephaestion was his second in command, his closest confidant, and by most ancient accounts, the person whose opinion mattered most to him. Hephaestion was given significant military commands, diplomatic missions, and administrative roles. But his most important function seems to have been simply being the person Alexander talked to, trusted, and could not imagine functioning without. Ancient sources are not coy about the nature of the relationship. Several ancient writers describe them as lovers explicitly. When Alexander's army reached Troy early in the campaign, and Alexander made a significant detour to visit Troy because he was deeply invested in the idea of following in Achilles' footsteps, Alexander laid a wreath on the tomb traditionally identified as Achilles. Hephaestion laid a wreath on the tomb of Patroclus. The parallel was deliberate. Alexander was positioning them both, consciously and publicly, within the tradition of the great male love at the heart of the Iliad. The relationship shaped the campaign in concrete ways. Hephaestion's loyalty to Alexander was absolute. There are accounts of other generals who quarrelled with Alexander over strategy or policy, but Hephaestion is consistently described as someone who subordinated everything to Alexander's purposes. Alexander trusted him with information and authority he gave to no one else. When the Persian queen mother Sisygambis made a diplomatic mistake and addressed Hephaestion rather than Alexander at their first meeting, Hephaestion was taller and more physically imposing. Alexander's response was generous and telling. He told her she had made no error because Hephaestion was also Alexander. When Hephaestion died in Ecbatana in 324 BCE of fever, possibly following excessive drinking during an illness when he should have been resting, Alexander's reaction was catastrophic by any measure. He refused food for days. He lay on the body. He had the royal physician executed for failing to save Hephaestion's life. He ordered the manes and tails of all the horses in the army shorn as a sign of mourning, He demolished the battlements of the nearest city as a gesture of grief, which is not a thing people normally do, and reflect a man who needed to break something large. He sent to the oracle at Siwa to ask whether Hephaestion could be worshipped as a god. He survived Hephaestion by less than a year. Whether Alexander's own death in Babylon in 323 BCE was related to his grief, whether it accelerated his drinking, whether it simply took something essential out of him, is impossible to know. What is documented is that from Hephaestion's death onward, Alexander was diminished in ways his court found alarming. The man who had reorganized the known world had, it appears, organized his emotional life around a single person, and without that person, something in the machinery failed. We've spent a good deal of time in the philosophy and mythology of ancient Greece, which is appropriate because the Greeks did love to theorize. But let's come down to street level for a moment and ask a more practical question. What did everyday life actually look like? If you were walking through the Agora of Athens in the 5th century BCE, what would you have seen? Who was walking with whom? What did affection look like in public? Was the theoretical permissiveness of the philosophers reflected in the actual behaviour of ordinary people going about their daily lives? The Agora was the centre of Athenian public life, a large open space surrounded by administrative buildings, temples, stowers and market stalls, through which the entire citizen population of the city moved on a daily basis. It was where you bought fish and olive oil and pottery. It was where court cases were argued and civic announcements were made. It was where philosophers walked and talked with their students. Socrates famously spent his days here, stopping strangers and asking them to define justice, or courage, or virtue, until they became frustrated enough to either engage seriously or walk away. It was where men transacted the full range of social, commercial and political life. What you would have seen, moving through it, was men. Almost all men, at least in the parts of the Agora where public business happened. Women of citizen class appeared in public for specific purposes, religious processions, trips to the well or the market, funerals, but the Agora in its full social function was male space. And within that male space, the full range of relationships between men was visible and normal. Men walked together, close. Men touched, hands on shoulders, arms around necks, the casual physical proximity of people who are genuinely comfortable with each other's bodies. Men who were Erastes and Eromenos were known as such within their social circle, and this was not hidden. Athenian comedy, which survives in considerable quantity through the plays of Aristophanes, gives a somewhat more irreverent picture of street-level attitudes. Aristophanes jokes about effeminate men, about men who have sold their dignity for money or advancement, about the gap between philosophical ideals of noble love and the actual messy reality of desire and politics. These jokes are sometimes used as evidence that ancient Greeks were not uniformly comfortable with all forms of male same-sex behaviour, and that's true. Comedy targets whatever creates social tension, and the jokes reveal that there were real hierarchies and real stigmas operating beneath the philosophical celebration. What the comedy doesn't show is anything like blanket condemnation of male love itself. The jokes are about specific behaviours, specific violations of the expected roles, specific failures of restraint or dignity, not about the existence of desire between men as such. You could be mocked for being too obvious about your feelings, too eager, too willing to subordinate your dignity to your desires. You could not be mocked, at least not in mainstream Athenian culture, simply for loving a man. Public displays of a certain kind were common enough to be unremarkable. The conventions around courtship, the older man bringing gifts, attending the gymnasium to watch his beloved exercise, accompanying him to social events, were public performances that everyone in the relevant social circle understood. The beloved was expected to be somewhat reserved, to accept the attention with grace rather than enthusiasm, to require the older man to demonstrate his worthiness over time. This whole choreography happened in the open, in social spaces shared by everyone, not in secret. The ancient Greeks were, to a degree that still manages to be striking, obsessed with the physical beauty of the human body, particularly the male body. The gymnasium was not just a place to exercise, it was a social institution, a philosophical venue, a space of display and evaluation that sat at the intersection of physical culture, education, and desire. Men exercised naked. The word gymnasium literally derives from the Greek for nakedness, and this was considered entirely normal, aesthetically valuable, and not at all something to be embarrassed about. The beautiful body was a public good. You arrive at the gymnasium in the late morning, which is when it is busiest. The space is large, a central courtyard with a running track around the outside, areas for wrestling, jumping and throwing, and covered colonnades where men walk and talk in the shade during the heat of the day. The smell is olive oil, and dust, and effort. Athletes rub oil onto their skin before exercise, both for the skin's protection and because oiled skin is simply more beautiful to look at. And the Greeks saw no reason not to acknowledge this openly. After exercise, they scrape the oil, dust and sweat from their bodies with a curved metal implement called a strigil. This process is itself depicted in Greek sculpture as worthy of representation. The philosophical stakes of physical beauty were high in Greek thought. Beauty was not considered merely pleasant. It was considered morally significant. The concept of kaloskagathos, beautiful and good, a compound word that fused physical and moral excellence, expressed a genuine Greek belief that external beauty and internal virtue were connected, that the beautiful body pointed toward a beautiful soul. This belief was easily mocked and often complicated by the obvious counterexamples. Socrates, the wisest man in Athens, was famously ugly, but it operated as a genuine cultural assumption nonetheless. For a young man at the gymnasium, being admired was not uncomfortable. It was expected and within limits, welcome. The gymnasium was partly a marriage market in the sense that a young man's presence and beauty, there was public information, available to the older men who were looking for someone to mentor and to attach themselves to. The conventions of courtship operated in this space as naturally as any other. An older man might watch a beautiful youth exercise, then find a way to speak to him, then begin the longer process of demonstrating his worthiness as an Erastes. Greek sculpture emerged directly from this gymnasium culture. The kouros figures of the archaic period, those standing male figures with their slight smiles and their careful anatomical detail, were products of a world that had spent generations looking carefully at naked male bodies in motion and developing aesthetic standards about what beautiful movement and proportion looked like. The classical nude, the idealized male figure that became one of Western art's most persistent subjects, was not an abstraction. It was grounded in the specific, particular experience of men who had spent their lives in gymnasia, watching bodies and developing exacting opinions about form. The gymnasium also functioned as a philosophical venue in the most literal sense. Plato's Academy, the school he founded around 387 BCE, that gave the English language the word academic, was located in a grove near a gymnasium on the outskirts of Athens. The Cynosarges gymnasium was associated with Antisthenes, the founder of Cynicism. The Lyceum gymnasium was where Aristotle taught, giving him the Latin name Peripatetics, the walkers, because he and his students apparently thought best while moving. Philosophy happened in gymnasia. The body and the mind occupied the same space, and the Greeks saw nothing contradictory about this. One of the things that makes ancient Greek attitudes towards same-sex desire so unusually well documented is that the Greeks depicted it extensively, explicitly, and without apparent anxiety in their art, particularly on pottery. The red figure and black figure vases that have survived in museums around the world contain scenes of courtship between men, scenes of the Symposium, scenes from mythology featuring divine same-sex desire, and an enormous amount of visual material that makes it impossible to argue these were marginal or shameful subjects. They were painted on everyday objects. They were used at dinner parties. Greek-painted pottery was not fine art in the museum sense. It was utilitarian. These were the vessels people actually used to mix wine and water, to store oil and grain, to pour libations at religious ceremonies. When a painter decorated a vase with a scene of an older man courting a youth, that vase went into domestic use. It sat on a shelf. It was passed around at a symposium. The images on it were not hidden away. They were part of the visual environment of daily life, in the same way that a pattern on wallpaper or a print on a coffee mug is part of the visual environment of daily life today. The subject matter was considered unremarkable enough to put on an object you'd use in front of guests. The conventions of courtship painting on Athenian pottery are well documented by art historians and follow recognizable patterns. The older man, bearded in a himation, reaches toward the younger man, chin and genitals the conventional points of contact in the gesture that scholars call the up and down, indicating respectful courtship. The younger man is depicted as somewhat reserved, neither aggressively welcoming nor aggressively refusing. Sometimes there are gifts, a hare, a rooster, a branch, being offered. The scene communicates the whole choreography of Greek courtship in a few painted figures, the pursuit, the dignity of the pursued, the gifts as proof of serious intent. These images appear alongside perfectly ordinary scenes of athletic competition, mythological episodes, symposia, and religious rituals. You could pick up an Athenian red figure kylix, a drinking cup, and find on one side a scene from the Trojan War and on the other a scene of male courtship, and this would have been considered a perfectly normal decorative choice. The two subjects belong to the same visual world, governed by the same aesthetic standards, carrying the same cultural weight. The survival of this material into the modern era has had its complications. Many of the most explicit pieces now in museum collections spent significant portions of the 19th and early 20th centuries in locked rooms called secretum or gabinetto segreto, secret cabinets, available only to scholars with appropriate credentials and presumably sufficient sturdiness of character. The British Museum had one. The National Archaeological Museum of Naples famously locked its collection of erotic antiquities away for decades, finally making the room publicly accessible in the 1980s. The objects themselves hadn't changed. What changed was who got to decide they were appropriate to look at. What this tells us is not primarily about the Greeks, it's about the 19th century's discomfort with what the Greeks had been perfectly comfortable putting on their everyday dishes. The objects are the same. The anxiety they generated was imported from a later era onto material that was produced without it. Modern museum goers who encounter these pieces in properly contextualized exhibitions are generally less alarmed than the Victorians were. The Greeks, looking at their own vases, were presumably not alarmed at all. It would be a mistake to conclude from all of this that ancient Greek society had no rules around desire and sexual behaviour. It had quite specific ones. They were just organised around entirely different principles than the ones we use today. The key categories were not the genders of the people involved, but the social roles they occupied. Questions of age, status, citizen versus non-citizen, active versus passive, voluntary versus coerced. These were the distinctions that mattered in Greek moral thinking about desire. Some behaviours were celebrated, others were deeply stigmatized. The line ran in unexpected places. The most fundamental distinction was between the active and passive roles in sexual encounters, and this distinction mapped directly onto social hierarchy. In Greek thinking, the active role, penetrating, was associated with masculinity, authority, and civic dignity. The passive role, being penetrated, was associated with subordination, femininity, and a kind of diminishment of civic standing. For an adult male citizen to voluntarily occupy the passive role was considered deeply shaming, not because it involved desire for another man, but because it involved the wrong relationship to power. It was the asymmetry of power, not the sex of the people involved, that organised Greek moral judgment. This meant that the same act could be completely acceptable in one social configuration and deeply stigmatised in another. A citizen man taking an active role with a slave, a foreigner or a lower status individual was entirely unremarkable. A citizen man voluntarily taking a passive role with anyone was a matter for social contempt and in some cases legal consequence. Athens had a law, attested by several sources, called atimia, civic dishonour, which could strip a man of his right to speak in the assembly, hold public office, or participate in civic life, and which could be applied to a man who had prostituted himself by taking the passive role for money. The law was not about the sex of his partners, it was about the dignity of the citizen body. This is a very different organisation of moral categories than modern Western society uses, and it's worth sitting with the strangeness of it. There was no concept of homosexuality as an identity category, but there was a very strong concept of the proper distribution of power in sexual relationships, and the violation of that distribution was what triggered moral condemnation, not the simple fact of desire between men. The eromenos in a pederastic relationship was, in this framework, navigating carefully. He was supposed to yield eventually to the honourable pursuit of an Erastes, but he was not supposed to appear eager or to take pleasure in the passive role. He was supposed to be the reluctant, dignified recipient of another man's legitimate desire, yielding out of affection and respect, not out of his own passion. When he reached adulthood, he was expected to transition into the active citizen role, to become an Erastes himself, to marry, to take his place in civic life as a full adult male. The passive role was for youth. It was not a permanent identity. Violations of these conventions were mocked, condemned, and in some cases legally sanctioned. Comedians targeted men who were seen as too available, too eager to please powerful men, too willing to sell their dignity. Politicians attacked their rivals by accusing them of having been passive in youth. The accusation was less about who they had slept with and more about whether they had maintained appropriate dignity in doing so. The rules were real, enforced through reputation, and understood by everyone operating within the social world of Athenian men. Let's go back to Plato's Symposium for a moment, because one speech in particular deserves its own segment. The comedian Aristophanes, yes, a comic playwright, is given one of the most poignant speeches in the entire history of Western philosophy, tells a creation myth. Originally, he says, humans were round creatures with 4 arms, 4 legs, and 2 faces. They came in 3 types: male-male, female-female, and male-female. The gods, threatened by their power, cut them in half. And ever since, every person has been searching for their other half, which might be male or female, depending on what the original creature was. This is Aristophanes' speech in essence, but the summary doesn't do justice to the texture of it, which is funny and tender and strangely moving in a way that probably shouldn't work, as well as it does coming from a playwright best known for jokes about flatulence and politicians. Plato's doing something quite deliberate in giving this speech to Aristophanes. He is acknowledging that the deepest truths about human longing might be expressed as well through myth and comedy as through the rigorous philosophical argument that Socrates will deploy later in the same evening. The original double humans in Aristophanes' telling were formidable. so strong and so proud that they threatened to storm Olympus and challenge the gods. Zeus faced a dilemma: destroy them entirely and lose the worship and sacrifices they provided, or diminish them enough to be manageable. He chose to cut each one in half, separating the two faces, pulling the skin around to the front and tying it at what we now call the navel, turning each original creature into two incomplete people who could barely function for grief and longing. Apollo rearranged the features so that each half could look at its own wound, the navel, and remember what had been lost. The result, in Aristophanes' telling, is the whole of human romantic and erotic life. People are wandering around looking for the other half of their original self. Those who are halves of a male-female original seek someone of the other sex. Those who are halves of a female-female original seek other women, and Aristophanes notes that this produces women who are strong and independent and not very interested in men, which he says with the mild, affectionate irreverence of a comedian who knows his audience. Those who are halves of a male-male original seek other men, and these, Aristophanes says with evident warmth, are among the finest people, the most courageous and most politically capable, because they are fragments of what was once the most powerful of the original creatures. This last point is striking and worth dwelling on. In a speech that treats all three types of original humans with equal seriousness, the male-male halves are specifically described as the best. They make the best leaders. They are the most courageous. They seek out their other halves not from licentiousness, but from something far deeper, a genuine recognition of soul in soul, a longing that is not merely physical but metaphysical. Aristophanes is not being sycophantic to the men in the room exactly, but he is making a philosophical argument that desire between men, when it arises from genuine recognition of a kindred soul, represents the highest form of what Eros can produce in human life. The speech ends with a vision of reunion, the moment when a half finds its matching half, and both feel that overwhelming sense of recognition that suggests not a new beginning, but a return. When two people meet and feel immediately that they have always known each other, that they are not strangers, that something essential has been restored, Aristophanes is offering a mythological explanation. These are halves of the same original creature, recognizing each other across the years and the distance, finally whole. The reason this speech has survived, the reason it is still read and quoted and felt, is that this image is recognizable to almost everyone who has experienced serious love. If ancient Greece produced one relationship that encapsulates all the philosophical, erotic, political, and deeply human complexity of the culture, it might be the relationship between Socrates and Alcibiades. Socrates was ugly by Greek standards, famously, almost comically ugly, with a snub nose and bulging eyes. Alcibiades was one of the most beautiful, charismatic, and politically dangerous men in Athens. They were drawn to each other with a force that neither seemed able to fully explain. Alcibiades wanted Socrates to want him in the ordinary physical way. Socrates consistently, maddeningly refused. Alcibiades appears in history as one of the most brilliant and most destructive Athenians of his generation, a military commander of genuine talent, a political figure of extraordinary charisma, and a man whose ambitions and instabilities contributed to some of Athens' greatest disasters. He was beautiful from childhood, sought after by older men in the conventional fashion, and apparently accustomed to getting whatever he wanted through a combination of looks, intelligence, and the sheer force of his personality. Then he met Socrates, and everything he thought he understood about how desire worked stopped making sense. In the Symposium, Alcibiades gives a long, wine-fueled speech about Socrates that is one of the most honest accounts of frustrated love in ancient literature. He describes approaching Socrates as the pursued rather than the pursuer, reversing the expected roles entirely, because Socrates' consistent attention to his soul rather than his beauty had made Alcibiades realize against his will that Socrates was the one in possession of something genuinely valuable. He describes dismissing his attendants and spending the night under Socrates' cloak, waiting. He describes Socrates sleeping peacefully through the entire experience, apparently unmoved, and waking in the morning with what Alcibiades could only read as complete indifference to the beauty that everyone else found overwhelming. Alcibiades is furious about this, in the way that beautiful people are furious when their beauty doesn't work. He is also unmistakably devoted. The speech is full of exasperation, but also full of something that sounds a great deal like love, or at least like the most intense admiration that exasperation can produce. He describes Socrates as like the figures of Silenus sold in the Agora, ugly on the outside, but full of gold statues of the gods on the inside. He says Socrates is the only person who has ever made him feel ashamed of his own life. He says he cannot live with Socrates, and he cannot live without him, which is a thing people say when they are in love and don't entirely want to admit it. Socrates, for his part, never stopped being interested in Alcibiades. In Plato's other works, he is shown following the young man, thinking about him, worrying about him, in the specific way that you worry about someone whose intelligence and potential you can see clearly, and whose choices are going to waste them. His refusal of Alcibiades' physical advances was not disinterest. It was Socratic pedagogy in its most demanding form. He was insisting that what Alcibiades needed, and what he was uniquely positioned to provide, was not physical intimacy, but the harder gift of being genuinely known and genuinely challenged. The relationship ended badly, as most things involving Alcibiades eventually did. Alcibiades made catastrophic political choices, defected to Sparta at a critical moment in the Peloponnesian War, then returned to Athens, then fled again, and was eventually murdered in exile. Socrates was tried and executed in 399 BCE, accused of corrupting the youth of Athens, and among the young men whose corruption was implied by the prosecution, Alcibiades was probably the most prominent example anyone could point to. The irony was complete. The philosopher who had spent his life trying to make Alcibiades better, to give him access to his own best self, was held partly responsible for the disasters that Alcibiades produced when no one, including Socrates, had succeeded. Thebes doesn't get nearly enough credit in the popular imagination of ancient Greece. Athens dominates the philosophical narrative, Sparta dominates the military one, and Thebes tends to get mentioned mainly as the city-state that produced the sacred band, and briefly, brilliantly, dominated Greek politics in the 4th century BCE before Alexander the Great came along and ended the discussion. But Theban aristocratic culture had its own sophisticated tradition of understanding male bonds, political, military, and erotic, as overlapping categories that were stronger together than they would have been kept apart. To understand Thebes, you have to understand what it meant to be a secondary power in a world dominated by two giants who despised each other. Athens and Sparta spent most of the 5th century BCE in various states of cold and hot conflict that eventually consumed the Greek world in the catastrophic Peloponnesian War. Thebes was caught between them, occasionally allied with Sparta, occasionally at odds, always aware that its survival depended on reading the larger situation correctly and positioning itself accordingly. This produced a particular kind of political intelligence, the intelligence of people who know they cannot simply overpower their rivals, and must therefore be cleverer, more cohesive, and more strategically precise than anyone around them. Theban aristocratic culture valued the bond between men as a political instrument in the most direct sense. The relationships between elite Theban men, shaped by shared upbringing, shared military service, and in many cases the explicit bonds of love between older and younger men, were understood as the social glue that held the governing class together. When men who had grown up together, trained together, and loved each other were also making political decisions together, the argument went, those decisions were more reliable, more committed, and harder to corrupt than the decisions of men whose bonds were merely transactional. The Theban general Pelopidas, who commanded the sacred band during its greatest victories, embodied this philosophy in his own life. His relationship with the statesman and general Epaminondas, the brilliant tactical mind who redesigned the Greek battle line and broke Spartan dominance at Leuctra, was one of the most celebrated friendships and partnerships in antiquity. Ancient sources describe them as inseparable from youth, devoted to each other across decades of shared political and military endeavour. Whether their relationship had an explicitly erotic dimension, as ancient sources sometimes implied, or was understood as the deepest form of philia, is a question the record doesn't resolve cleanly. The Greeks would not have found the distinction as important as modern readers do. What Thebes produced in the generation of Pelopidas and Epaminondas was a brief, extraordinary moment of political and military supremacy, built consciously on the philosophy that bonds of love between men made those men harder to defeat. Epaminondas redesigned the Theban battle line by concentrating his best troops in a deep column on one flank, rather than spreading them evenly across the front. At Leuctra in 371 BCE, this oblique attack shattered the Spartan right wing before the rest of the battle could develop, and Sparta never fully recovered its dominance. The sacred band, fighting as the spearhead of that attack, performed exactly as the theory predicted. Theban supremacy lasted approximately a generation. Epaminondas was killed at the Battle of Mantinea in 362 BCE, a battle that Thebes technically won, but that cost them the general who had made their victories possible. Without him, the political and military coherence that his partnership with Pelopidas and the culture around the sacred band had maintained began to dissolve. By the time Philip of Macedon arrived with his reorganized army and his teenage son at Chaeronea in 338 BCE, Thebes was a diminished power. The sacred band died where it stood, and the brief Theban experiment in building an empire on love ended in a field in Boeotia. 300 bodies lying in formation, undisturbed and unretreating until the very end. The symposium officially began with dinner and continued with wine and conversation, but ancient sources, and there are many, make fairly clear that the evening didn't always end with a philosophical debate. The lines between intellectual companionship, artistic performance, and physical intimacy were blurry by design at the symposium. The flute girls and the cupbearers moved through the room. Wine circulated in careful ratios. Inhibitions loosened. What happened next was not, by Greek standards, a departure from the intellectual purposes of the gathering. It was understood as a natural extension of them. The progression of a symposium followed a recognizable arc. The early part of the evening was for serious conversation. The speeches, the philosophical games, the poetry recitation, the careful demonstration of wit and learning that established a man's standing among his peers. As the evening advanced and the wine circulated, always mixed with water, but always circulating, the atmosphere shifted. The formalities relaxed. Men who had been performing for each other began simply being with each other, which is a different thing and often a more revealing one. The physical environment encouraged closeness that daytime public life did not. Men reclined on shared couches, close enough to whisper, close enough to touch without making it the centre of attention. The lighting was low, oil lamps cast warm, limited pools of light that left most of the room in shadow. The music from the flute girl was continuous, filling silences that might otherwise become awkward, creating a kind of ambient permission for whatever was happening in the room. This was all engineered. The Symposium was a carefully constructed social technology for producing a specific kind of intimacy, and the Greeks understood exactly what they were building when they built it. What happened after the formal portion of the evening is described in various ancient sources with varying degrees of directness. Comedy provides some of the most unfiltered accounts. Aristophanes' plays contain jokes that make absolutely clear what some symposia devolved into as the night advanced and the wine ran low. Philosophical texts are more restrained but not entirely silent. Plato's Symposium ends with most of the guests asleep or departed, and Socrates still awake and talking, apparently impervious to both wine and exhaustion, which ancient readers would have understood as another demonstration of his extraordinary self-control. The cupbearer, the youth who poured the wine and moved through the room, occupied a position that everyone in the room understood as both practical and charged. In households wealthy enough to employ beautiful attendants, the cupbearer was often chosen partly for his appearance, and his role in the evening was understood as involving a kind of ambient eroticism that didn't need to be stated. He was not a philosopher. He was not there to give speeches. He was there to pour wine and to be beautiful while doing it, and both functions were considered legitimate contributions to the evening's success. The morning after a symposium, the komos, the revel that sometimes spilled into the streets as the party moved or broke up, is depicted on pottery with the cheerful chaos you'd expect. Men in various states of dishevelment, making their way home through a city that was just waking up, occasionally still singing. The city of Athens contained within itself, every night that symposia were held across its neighbourhoods, 100 small worlds of wine and music and conversation and desire operating simultaneously in private rooms, and the city simply accommodated this as part of what a city was for. What the Symposium created over time was a culture in which intellectual and erotic life were understood as genuinely continuous. The man who desired a beautiful youth was expected to pursue that desire through conversation, through shared philosophical inquiry, through the long, patient work of demonstrating that his interest was in the whole person, rather than merely the body, and then, eventually perhaps, through the physical expression of that interest. The desire was the beginning of something. What it became depended on the character of the people involved. This was the Greek ideal, at least. The Greek reality, as comedy gleefully documented, was considerably messier. Lesbos in the archaic period was one of the cultural centres of the Greek world, wealthy, sophisticated, connected by trade to the wider Mediterranean. It was the kind of place where poetry was taken seriously as a social and spiritual practice, not merely as entertainment. Into this world Sappho was born, and into this world she released poems that described the texture of female desire with a specificity that has no real parallel in the ancient record. She wrote about the flush of heat in the body, the difficulty of breathing, the way a room seems to reorganize itself around one particular person. Lesbos sits in the northeastern Aegean, close to the coast of what is now Turkey, and in the 7th and 6th centuries BCE it was genuinely prosperous, a trading island with connections running east toward the great cities of the Near East and west toward mainland Greece and beyond. The city of Mytilene, where Sappho lived, was politically active and culturally ambitious, the kind of place that produced poets and philosophers alongside merchants and sailors. It was also, by most accounts, a place where women of the educated class had somewhat more visible social lives than they did in Athens, more likely to attend public events, more likely to participate in the religious and cultural life of the community. Sappho's poems were performed. This is important, and sometimes overlooked in discussions that treat her primarily as a literary figure. Ancient Greek lyric poetry was not read silently by individuals sitting alone. It was sung, accompanied by a lyre, in social settings. Sappho performed her poems or had them performed, for audiences who knew her and knew the people she was writing about. When she wrote about a specific woman, about Atthis, about Anactoria, about the unnamed woman in Fragment 31 whose laughter is making Sappho lose the capacity to function, she was singing about real people in front of real audiences in a community where those people were known. This makes Sappho's poetry not a private diary, but something more like a public declaration, performed desire, shared with a community that apparently received it as a normal part of social and artistic life. She was not confessing in secret. She was composing and performing, in the highest tradition of her culture, poems whose subject happened to be her desire for women. The ancient world's celebration of her as one of the greatest lyric poets who ever lived suggests that this subject matter was not considered a disqualification for artistic greatness, that her poems were evaluated on their poetic quality, and that her poetic quality was considered extraordinary. What we can reconstruct of the community around Sappho, the Theosos, whatever exactly it was, suggests a gathering of young women in which education, music, poetry, religious practice, and deep personal attachments were all present simultaneously. Girls came to her apparently from families across Lesbos, and possibly from other islands and regions, to learn music and poetry and the social graces that would serve them when they married and took up their adult roles. They left to marry, and Sappho wrote wedding songs for them, songs that are tender and also sometimes tinged with the specific sorrow of someone who knows the person leaving is going somewhere she cannot follow. The poems about loss, separation, and longing, for Atthis who has gone away, for Anactoria who is now somewhere with the Lydian army, have the specific weight of someone writing about particular, named people who are genuinely missed. This is not metaphor. This is a woman with a lyre and a community and a series of attachments that ended the way attachments in that world inevitably ended, with girls growing up, marrying away, disappearing into domestic life in other households, other cities. Sappho was left with her poems. We're left with fragments of those poems. And in those fragments, the desire is as specific and as undeniable as anything in the ancient record. For several centuries, ancient Greek culture, including its attitudes toward desire between men, existed in something like its own bubble. Then the Romans arrived, absorbed Greek culture with enormous enthusiasm, and introduced a set of complications that significantly changed the picture. Roman attitudes toward male same-sex desire were not a simple continuation of the Greek model. They borrowed pieces of it, reframed others, and added their own layers of stigma, class consciousness, and legal restriction. The arrival of Roman dominance over the Greek world marks the beginning of a long, slow shift in how these things were understood and talked about. Rome absorbed Greece gradually, militarily, politically, and then culturally, in a process that the Roman poet Horace described with elegant irony. Captive Greece captured its captor. Roman elites became obsessed with Greek culture, learned Greek, read Greek philosophy, decorated their homes with Greek sculpture, and sent their sons to Athens and Rhodes to study rhetoric and philosophy. The gymnasium became fashionable in Rome, which alarmed conservative Romans like Cato the Elder considerably. Greek intellectual life flooded into Rome as both a genuine enrichment and, in conservative eyes, a moral hazard. Roman culture had its own framework for thinking about desire between men, and it shared the Greek emphasis on active versus passive roles rather than the sex of the partners involved. Roman law and Roman social convention were broadly comfortable with a citizen man taking an active role, with partners of lower status, slaves, freedmen, foreigners, regardless of their sex. What was stigmatized, as in Greece, was the adult male citizen taking the passive role. This was called stuprum, and was considered a serious violation of the dignity appropriate to a Roman man. The Latin word for the stigmatized behavior was not about the sex of the partners, it was about the power dynamic. Where Rome diverged from Greece most significantly was in its attitude toward the pederastic model that Greek culture had formalized and celebrated. Roman law eventually developed protections, the lex scantinia, whose exact provisions are debated but which appears to have prohibited sexual relations with freeborn Roman boys. This was a meaningful departure from the Greek framework, in which the formal courtship of elite youth by older men was publicly celebrated as a pillar of education and social formation. Rome was less comfortable with this, at least officially, and the law reflected a different organization of the boundary between acceptable and unacceptable. Roman emperors and their private lives added further complexity. Julius Caesar was mocked by his political enemies with the accusation that he had been passive in his youth with the king of Bithynia. The accusation was political, designed to undermine his dignity, and Caesar reportedly never stopped being annoyed by it. Hadrian's love for the young Bithynian Antinous, who drowned in the Nile in 130 CE and was subsequently deified at Hadrian's insistence, with temples built across the empire and a city named after him, was one of the most publicly acknowledged same-sex attachments in the ancient world. Hadrian made no attempt to conceal his grief or his devotion. The Roman world received it with a full range of responses from genuine sympathy to quiet skepticism, but nobody seriously suggested that the Emperor of Rome could be dethroned for it. Christianity arrived into this complex Roman world and changed the terms of the conversation fundamentally, introducing a framework in which certain desires were not merely undignified or socially disruptive but genuinely sinful, offensive to God, and requiring suppression rather than governance. That shift took centuries to fully work itself through the culture. But it was underway by the time the Western Roman Empire began to fracture, and by the early medieval period, the Greek world's casual integration of same-sex desire into philosophy, mythology, and daily social life had become something that required explanation, apology, or willful misreading. Around the 1st and 2nd centuries CE, the Greek biographer and essayist Plutarch wrote a dialogue called the Erotikos, sometimes translated as Dialogue on Love, in which various characters debate the merits of love for women versus love for men, with great feeling and varying degrees of good faith on both sides. What makes the dialogue remarkable is not that it reaches a conclusion. It doesn't, really. What makes it remarkable is that the debate was still being had, centuries after the classical period, in sophisticated literary form, suggesting that the questions ancient Greece had opened had never fully been closed. Plutarch himself was a serious, learned, deeply humane writer whose biographical works, the parallel lives, pairing Greek and Roman historical figures, remain among the most readable things produced in the ancient world. He was also a priest of Apollo at Delphi, a man of genuine piety and moral seriousness, and someone who held fairly conventional views about marriage and family life. His engagement with the question of love between men was therefore not that of a celebrant, but of someone genuinely wrestling with competing claims, someone who respected the tradition, understood its philosophical weight, and also had his own convictions about where the highest forms of love were to be found. The Erotikos is set during a real or plausibly real social occasion, a dispute over whether a wealthy widow should be allowed to pursue the young man she wants to marry, who's been promised by his family to another match. Various characters take sides, and the debate expands naturally from this specific case into the larger question of what kinds of love are genuine, valuable, and philosophically defensible. One character argues passionately for the superiority of love between men, its philosophical depth, its connection to virtue, its freedom from the merely physical entanglements of heterosexual love. Another argues, with equal passion, for the love between men and women, its naturalness, its connection to the gods' purposes in creating human reproduction, its foundation in genuine partnership. What's revealing is the quality of both arguments. Plutarch, as author, gives both sides real intellectual substance. Neither is dismissed, neither is presented as obviously wrong. The dialogue form which Plato had perfected was designed precisely for this kind of genuine suspension, for holding two compelling positions in tension without forcing premature resolution. Plutarch uses it here to document the fact that, in the 1st and 2nd centuries CE, educated people in the Greek-speaking world were still having the same fundamental argument that Plato's characters had been having 5 centuries earlier. The Erotikos also contains some of Plutarch's most beautiful writing about marriage. He was, in his other work, genuinely convinced that marriage between a man and a woman could be a profound philosophical partnership, a relationship of mutual growth and deepening understanding that rivaled anything the Symposium tradition celebrated. His advice to bride and groom treats marriage with a seriousness and warmth that was not universal in antiquity. He was not arguing against male love from contempt. He was arguing for something else he valued, and doing so honestly. The debate Plutarch documented was one the ancient world never fully resolved, because the ancient world ended before the question was settled, replaced by a new framework, organised around different premises, that declared certain forms of desire not merely inferior but sinful. The Erotikos stands as a kind of last echo of the old argument. Two positions, both taken seriously, both anchored in genuine philosophical traditions, still contending in the centuries after the classical moment had passed. After Plutarch, the terms of the debate changed. The question stopped being which form of love was higher, and started being which forms of desire were permissible at all. We've established that ancient Greece had a relatively permissive attitude towards same-sex desire within specific frameworks. But what happened when those frameworks were violated? What happened when the rules were broken? When a man who was expected to take only the active role was discovered to have taken the passive one voluntarily, without coercion? When a man of citizen status was seen to be subordinate in ways that citizens weren't supposed to be? The Greek legal record, such as it survives, contains some genuinely interesting answers to these questions, including a law that stripped Athenian citizens of their civic rights under specific circumstances. The most famous legal case involving these questions is the prosecution of Timarchus, which took place in 346 BCE and was recorded by the orator Aeschines in a speech that survives essentially complete. Aeschines was prosecuting Timarchus, a political ally of his enemy Demosthenes, and the charge was heteresis, which meant something like selling oneself as a companion or prostituting oneself. The accusation was not that Timarchus had desired men or had relationships with men. It was that he had, as a young man, allowed himself to be kept by wealthy older men in exchange for money and support, that he had sold the passive role, and in doing so had surrendered the dignity appropriate to a free Athenian citizen. The law under which Timarchus was prosecuted, the same Atimia framework mentioned in an earlier segment, was quite specific about what it prohibited. It was not a general prohibition on same-sex desire or behaviour between men. It was a prohibition on Athenian citizens prostituting themselves, defined as taking the passive role in exchange for payment. The distinction was between a relationship governed by proper courtship conventions, in which the older man pursued, offered gifts, demonstrated commitment, and the younger man eventually yielded out of affection, and a transaction in which money directly purchased sexual access, which degraded the person who accepted it to the status of someone who had sold their civic dignity. Aeschines won the case. Timarchus was convicted and lost his civic rights. He could no longer speak in the assembly, hold office, or participate in public life. The conviction was a political blow to Demosthenes as much as a personal disaster for Timarchus. But what makes the case fascinating for our purposes is what it reveals about the precise location of the line. Aeschines himself in the same speech is at pains to distinguish between the dishonourable behaviour he is prosecuting and the honourable tradition of male. Love he explicitly celebrates, citing the example of Achilles and Patroclus among others as evidence that love between men was noble and ancient and not at issue here. He was not attacking male love. He was attacking a specific violation of civic dignity within a context that everyone in the courtroom understood. Mockery was the other enforcement mechanism, operating below the level of law. Athenian comedy was relentless in targeting men who were perceived as having violated the proper role distribution, men who were effeminate, men who were too obviously available, men whose past history of passive behaviour in youth was known or suspected. The comedian's art was to make these violations publicly ridiculous, which served a social function of maintaining the norms even without legal enforcement. You might never be prosecuted, but you could be mocked into social uselessness by a good comedian with the right material and a willing audience, and in a culture where public reputation was the primary currency of civic life, that was a very serious sanction. The overall picture that emerges is of a society with genuine rules, genuinely enforced, organised around specific principles, not the gender of desire, but the social role and dignity of the citizen body. Within those rules, desire between men was celebrated, philosophised about, depicted in art, and built into the structure of military and civic life. Outside those rules, specific violations were punished by law, or by ridicule, or by social exclusion. The line was not where modern readers expect it to be, but it was real, and everyone knew where it was. When you step back from the specifics, the philosophical speeches, the pottery, the military units, the fragments of Sappho, and try to see what ancient Greece actually contributed to the long human story of understanding desire, a few things become clear. The Greeks asked questions about love, beauty, and the relationship between physical desire and the deeper yearning for connection that no one had asked quite so systematically before. Some of their answers were specific to their time and culture, limited, stratified, and by modern ethical standards, deeply problematic in places. But some of what they asked has never really gone away. The legacy begins with vocabulary. The words we use to think about desire, erotic, platonic, aphrodisiac, lesbian, sapphic, all come directly from Greek, from Eros, from Plato, from Aphrodite, from the island of Lesbos, from Sappho herself. This is not coincidence. These words persist because the Greek framework for thinking about desire was so influential, so thoroughly woven into Western intellectual tradition, that even when later cultures rejected the content of that framework, they kept reaching for its vocabulary. You can call something platonic and be invoking Plato's entire theory of love without knowing it. The Greeks are inside the language, whether or not they're in the consciousness of the person using it. The philosophical legacy runs even deeper. Plato's account of love, the ladder of desire that Diotima describes to Socrates, rising from the beautiful body to beautiful souls to beauty itself, became one of the organizing ideas of Western philosophy and theology. Christian Neoplatonists in late antiquity found in it a framework they could adapt, redirecting the erotic ascent toward the divine. Renaissance humanists rediscovered it and found in it a way to think about the love between men that was philosophically dignified and classically sanctioned. The concept of Platonic love, meaning a love that has transcended the physical and operates at the level of souls, derives directly from this tradition, filtered through centuries of reinterpretation that selectively emphasized the transcendence and quietly set aside the desire that was always also present. The recovery of Sappho in fragments and later in more complete form as papyrus discoveries added to the record has been one of the recurring intellectual events of the past 2 centuries. Each rediscovery, each new fragment, each new translation, each new generation reading her with fresh eyes has produced a fresh reckoning with what it means to find, in the oldest layers of Western literary tradition, a woman writing with absolute precision about desire for other women. She was not marginal, she was canonical, she was the 10th muse, and what she was writing about was not marginal either. It was, by the standards of her world, as legitimate a subject for the highest poetic art as anything Homer described. The Greeks also bequeathed to subsequent centuries a problem, the problem of how to deal with the evidence they left behind. Every era that followed has had to decide what to do with the pottery, the philosophy, the mythology, the explicit texts, how to integrate or explain away the fact that a civilization foundational to Western identity had integrated same-sex desire into its highest cultural and intellectual achievements without apparent anxiety. Some eras locked the pottery in cabinets, some eras rewrote the translations, some eras found in the evidence exactly what they needed, a classical precedent, an ancient authority, a reminder that what was being condemned as unnatural had been honoured by the civilization that invented democracy, tragedy, and philosophy. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep in whatever corner of the world you're listening from, what's worth carrying with you is this. The Greeks were not perfect. Their society was built on slavery. Their treatment of women was, in most cases, indefensible. Their celebrated tradition of male love contained within it practices that no ethical framework today would excuse. And they also asked, with extraordinary seriousness and beauty, some of the most important questions humans have ever asked about what it means to want another person, about where desire comes from, what it points toward, and what it makes possible in a human life. Those questions are still open. They were open when Sappho was writing on Lesbos. They were open when Plato was writing in Athens. They are open now. And there is something quietly remarkable about the fact that 3,000 years later, in the small hours of the morning, people are still lying in the dark thinking about them. Let's talk about the Olympics, not the ones with corporate sponsorships and television rights negotiations, but the original ones, held every 4 years at Olympia in honour of Zeus, beginning in 776 BCE and continuing for over 1,000 years without interruption. The ancient Olympics were not a sporting event with a side order of religion. They were a religious festival with a side order of sport, and like everything else in Greek public life, they operated at the intersection of the sacred, the competitive, and the unmistakably erotic. You arrive at Olympia after days of travel on roads crowded with pilgrims, merchants, and athletes from every corner of the Greek world. The sanctuary of Zeus is enormous, a walled precinct containing temples, altars, treasuries, and the sacred olive grove from which the victors' crowns would be cut. The atmosphere is overwhelming, tens of thousands of people, the smell of sacrifice, the noise of a city that has assembled itself from nothing for this specific purpose, and will dissolve again in a week. It happens every 4 years, and during the Games, even wars were suspended. The Olympics were considered sacred enough that armies stopped fighting to let athletes and spectators travel safely. This should tell you something about how seriously the Greeks took competition. The athletes competed naked. This was not considered remarkable. It was the Greek standard for athletic competition, as natural and unremarkable as it was in the gymnasium at home. The word gymnasium had prepared you for this. The bodies on display at Olympia were the finest in the Greek world, years of training and selection concentrated into a few days of visible, public excellence. Every event, running, wrestling, boxing, the pentathlon, the pancration, chariot racing was a performance of physical perfection before an audience of thousands, and that audience looked and admired and judged with the full seriousness that Greek culture brought to the evaluation of beautiful things. Victory at Olympia was transformative. A victor didn't just win a crown of olive leaves, he became, for practical purposes, a hero. He was celebrated in his home city with processions and feasts. He was commissioned odes by the greatest lyric poets of the age. Pindar's Epinetian odes, written to celebrate athletic victors, are among the most formally ambitious poems in the Greek language, full of mythology and moral philosophy organised around the central fact of a beautiful young man who ran faster or wrestled better than everyone else on the planet. Cities sometimes knocked holes in their walls to let a returning Olympic champion enter without having to use the ordinary gates, the idea being that a city that had produced such a man needed no walls for its defence. The erotic dimension of this culture was entirely explicit. Pindar's odes are full of the beauty of the victors, their gleaming limbs, their grace in motion, the radiance that victory produces in an already beautiful young body. The language is not metaphorical. The poems are addressed to real young men, performed at real celebrations, in a world where everyone in the room understood that the poet's admiration for the victor was both aesthetic and erotic in the broad Greek sense, that beauty and desire and philosophical admiration were not separated into distinct categories but operated as a single, continuous response to excellence. Statues of victors were erected at Olympia and in their home cities, idealized portraits in bronze and marble, the finest sculptors of the age commissioned to capture a specific person's specific excellence in permanent form. The tradition of Greek athletic sculpture that produced some of the most celebrated works in Western art, the discus thrower, the doryphoros, the countless kouroi in museums around the world, was rooted in this practice of commemorating real men whose bodies had demonstrated real excellence. The sculptures are idealized, but the idealization was grounded in careful, sustained observation of bodies actually in motion. Greek sculptors spent their careers in gymnasia, looking. The Olympics also produced its share of scandalous stories because 10,000 people assembled for a week around enormous quantities of competitive intensity and religious fervour will inevitably generate material. There are ancient accounts of athletes who were celebrated for their beauty as much as their victories, who were pursued by admirers from across the Greek world, who received love poetry as well as odes, who became, in a culture that placed beauty next to virtue, something very close to what a modern person would recognize as a celebrity. The difference is that nobody in that culture pretended the admiration was purely aesthetic or purely about athletic achievement. It was all of those things simultaneously, and the Greeks saw no need to untangle them. What the Olympics demonstrate in this context is the degree to which desire and excellence were genuinely integrated in Greek public life, not as a private undercurrent, but as an acknowledged, celebrated, publicly sanctioned dimension of what made competition meaningful. You weren't just watching the fastest man in the world, you were watching the most beautiful man in the world demonstrate his beauty through speed. You were watching Eros and Arete, desire and excellence operating in the same body, on the same track, in front of the same crowd. And the crowd understood this and cheered for all of it at once. We have covered a great deal of ground tonight: gymnasium culture and symposia, Sappho and Alexander, the sacred band and the pottery and the legal cases and the philosophers. But before we begin to close, it's worth asking the simplest and perhaps most important question directly. What did the ancient Greeks actually believe love was for? Not as a social institution, not as a political instrument, not as a subject for poetry, but fundamentally at the level of their deepest thinking about human life. What was the point of all that desire? The answer, when you assemble it from across the various philosophical traditions, is surprisingly consistent and surprisingly large. The Greeks believed love was for becoming a better person, not in a sentimental greeting card sense, in a rigorous, demanding, philosophically serious sense. They believed that genuine love, Eros that had matured beyond mere physical attraction, was one of the primary mechanisms by which human beings grew into their best selves. That the longing for another person, when followed correctly, led outward into the world and upward toward wisdom in ways that nothing else quite replicated. Diotima's ladder in Plato's Symposium is the most systematic version of this argument, but the intuition runs throughout Greek thought. Aristotle, who disagreed with Plato about almost everything, shared the conviction that deep friendship, philia of the highest kind, between people of genuine virtue, was essential to the good life. Not a luxury, not an emotional garnish on top of more important things, but genuinely necessary. A person without deep bonds to others was either a beast or a god, he said, not fully human, missing something essential to what human flourishing actually required. The isolated individual, self-sufficient and needing no one, was not the Greek ideal of the good life. It was the definition of something gone wrong. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it runs somewhat against what the modern world sometimes thinks it absorbed from the Greeks. The popular image of Greek philosophy emphasizes reason, logic, self-control, the examined life of the individual mind. All of that is genuinely present, but it coexists with an equally strong conviction that human beings are constitutively relational, that we become ourselves through our bonds with others, that the deepest wisdom is produced not in isolation but in conversation, that desire and love and the vulnerability of genuine attachment are not obstacles to the philosophical life but engines of it. Socrates, the philosopher most associated with rigorous rational self-examination, spent his entire life in conversation with other people, in the Agora, at symposia, following beautiful young men and asking them questions until they were forced to think carefully. He didn't retreat to a mountain. He didn't write books in a room alone. He lived in the thick of human connection, driven by something that looks a great deal like love, for Athens, for his interlocutors, for the truth that he believed could only be found through genuine encounter with another mind. The Greeks believed that love sharpened you, that being truly seen by another person, being known, being challenged, being held to your own best standard by someone whose opinion genuinely mattered, produced a kind of growth that no amount of private reading or solitary reasoning could replicate. The Erastes was supposed to become a better man through the responsibilities of mentorship. The Eromenos was supposed to become a better man through the model his mentor provided. Friends of genuine virtue were supposed to push each other toward excellence. And the beloved, in Plato's most idealistic vision, was supposed to function as a kind of living reminder of the form of beauty itself, a particular, embodied instance of something universal and eternal, whose presence in your life kept pulling your attention upward toward what mattered most. This is what ancient Greece, at its philosophical best, believed love was for, not comfort, not security, not the satisfaction of desire exactly, though desire was the beginning of it. Love was for transformation, the slow, difficult, sometimes painful process of becoming more fully yourself through your encounter with another person who saw you clearly and refused to let you be less than you were capable of being. It was an enormous thing to ask of another person. It was an enormous thing to offer, and the Greeks, whatever their failures and limitations, asked and offered it with a seriousness and a beauty that the world has been trying to match ever since. So tonight, you have travelled a long way. You have walked through the Agora in the early morning light, smelled olive oil and salt air, and listened to men argue about the nature of beauty until the lamps burned low. You have watched the sacred band hold its formation at Chaeronea and read the fragments of a woman on a sunbright island who found the exact words for something that had never quite been said before. You have sat at the edge of a symposium, heard Aristophanes describe round creatures cut in half and wandering the earth looking for each other, and felt, somewhere in the quiet part of yourself, that faint shock of recognition that comes when something ancient turns out to be about right now. Ancient Greece was not a paradise. It was a world of profound inequality, of slavery and exclusion, of rules that protected some people and ignored others entirely. The freedoms it celebrated were real, but they were real for a narrow slice of humanity, and the cost of those freedoms was paid by people whose names we mostly don't know. None of that should be softened or forgotten. And yet, these were people who looked at desire, at the overwhelming, inconvenient, reorganizing force of wanting another person, and decided it was worth thinking about seriously, worth writing about carefully, worth building philosophy and poetry and sculpture and military strategy around. They did not treat love as a distraction from the important business of life. They treated it as some of the most important business of life. They asked what it was for, where it pointed, what it could make of a person if followed honestly and well. And they answered those questions with a seriousness and a beauty that 2,500 years have not managed to exhaust. Somewhere in the ruins of Knossos and the fragments of Sappho and the marble lion above the grave at Cheironeia, something endures that is not merely historical. The round creatures are still out there, wandering. The ladder still rises from the beautiful body towards something that cannot quite be named. The symposium lamps are long extinguished, but the questions asked beneath them are still open, still warm, still waiting for whoever picks them up next. So tonight, as you pull your blanket a little closer and let the day begin its long retreat, maybe carry one quiet thought with you into sleep, that the desire to know another person, to be known by them, to become something better in the light of that knowing, that this is not a modern invention or a private peculiarity. It is ancient. It is documented. It is carved in marble and painted on pottery and sung in fragments that survived fire and flood, and the long indifference of centuries specifically because they were too precise, too true to let go of entirely. The Greeks were stubborn like that, so it turns out is love. Good night.